Welcome to Historical Veracity, where history comes alive right before your eyes. Today, on Land of History, Israel's Conquest and Biblical Archaeology Unveiled, we present Episode 6, How Does Archaeology Work? Dive into the depths of the past with us as we explore the tools, techniques, and tantalizing mysteries of archaeological science. Are you ready to unearth the secrets of ancient civilizations? Let's begin our adventure. We will return to the data mosaic in the Bible, and now address the question of how reliable archaeology is. What are its conclusions based on, and what type of conclusions can be drawn from it? How is it possible that researchers holding the same data deny Israel's settlement in its land in the 13th century BCE? How can different archaeologists draw different conclusions from the same findings? Do the findings truly represent history? Clearly, the quantity of archaeological findings is minimal, and without a historical narrative, it's almost impossible to reconstruct events. Throughout the vast period when the people of Israel lived in its land, there is not a single Israeli inscription mentioning the word Israel, and there are no official inscriptions from kings, rulers, generals, temples, etc. An archaeological dig could not have revealed to us who the people were that lived here for so many years. And of course, if we read the events described in history books, we mostly cannot find archaeological evidence for them, and without historical records, we wouldn't be able to reconstruct them. If we look at our history in the last 100 years in the land of Israel, could anyone have reconstructed all the complex events we have undergone here from archaeology alone? When we talk about thousands of years ahead, and when the percentage of preserved findings is minimal, for many generations, scholars did not attempt to reconstruct history from inanimate findings, except for inscriptions that tell a historical story, similar to documents and books. Only about 100 years ago was archaeology established as a method, following the recognition and differentiation between products used in different periods: stone, bronze, iron age, pottery typical of periods and places, and more. But what happened in those stone, bronze, iron scenes? Yohanan Aharoni says, "We stand in the field of humanities where there is no way but to use assessments and assumptions." The archaeologist Michael Aviona says, "The material is open to different interpretations by the researchers, who interpret it according to their way and opinion, and sometimes according to the historical view they hold." We will illustrate how interpretation depends on assumptions and guesses. It is quite reasonable to date a culture that seems primitive as preceding a more developed one. But is this rule always correct? Of course not. Do types of tools and construction prove advancement or delay? What would an archaeologist think when looking at the remnants of the settlement in the state of Israel? Were stone houses not built here in the 19th century in the European style, and more than 100 years after them, still huts and transitions were built? Can archaeological remnants truly reconstruct all types of cultures, and the factors that led them to build in different ways, and use different types of tools and items? Can wars and conquests be reconstructed based on archaeological remains? Will it be possible to deduce population density and living conditions from Gaza to Kibbutz Kerem Shalom located 1 kilometer to the east? We date a layer based on the presence or absence of iron, but are the layers sterile? And could it not be that no iron products remained because they were collected or disintegrated? Iron is less durable than stone and bronze, or iron found deeper came from a later period anyway. History describes periods when a conquering people halted iron production. It might be that a poor society had no ability to produce or purchase iron. The possibilities on the ground are very complicated. There are no clear signs between layers. The surface of the land is not necessarily uniform. Each researcher can determine a boundary between layers as he understands, or limit the boundaries of use by the different periods. In many places, a decline in quality and form is seen, changes between one site and another stemming from differences in skill and method, not necessarily different periods and cultures. Construction techniques come with large time gaps without a clear explanation. For example, loop walls were found in Asia Minor in the 15th century BCE, and in Israel, usually in the 10th century. Changes may be cyclical, not necessarily along a line of development. If we set aside the findings and the attempt to fit them into the equation for a moment and look at the reality around us, we see how archaeology cannot reconstruct the complexity in history and life. 2 Indian tribes, the Hopi and the Navajo, live next to each other in eastern Arizona. The Hopi are veteran farmers who have succeeded in growing crops even where the whites could not, whereas the Navajo plant corn to a lesser extent and turn to sheep herding. The Hopi build multi-storied houses in the form of a squared H, while the Navajo live in tents. The Hopi create the finest pottery in all of America. The Navajo's pottery is poor. The Hopi plant cotton, unlike their neighbors. Among the Hopi, the men spin and weave. Among the Navajo, the women do. The Hopi marry one wife. The Navajo are polygamous. Both tribes use the same spells, but the former use them for agricultural purposes, and the latter for healing the sick. Among the Navajo, the son-in-law does not speak with his mother-in-law, while the Hopi mock this custom. The Hopi are quiet people, whereas the Navajo are quarrelsome and argumentative. The Bushmen and the Hottentots live in the same area. The Bushmen are hunters and gatherers. The Hottentots are herders. The Bushmen live in caves, the Hottentots in beehive-like tents. The Bushman has a bow and arrow, and the Hottentot has a spear. R. Livy. Is it always possible to deduce a general rule of development from various differences? Clearly not. Logic must be used, of course, but the limitations of archaeological conclusions must be understood. The assumption on which archaeology is based, of signs of development and advancement in production, and according to its different stages, the dating is determined. This does not always stand the test of reality. In Persia, a seal was found describing a king from the Achaemenid period that began in the 6th century. The formula is very similar to that of a seal from the 13th century. Parada. Also, in the decorations of a tomb, the ancient style returns. We do not know how this motif evolved from period to period. The aspiration to renew their achievements from ancient times was characteristic of all the ancient Near Eastern countries in the 7th, the 6th centuries. Hence came the revival of archaic forms in Egypt and Babylon, Yavin Mazar. In 1959, Mel Malawan started excavations in Nimrud on the Historical in Iraq, and David Oates continued them. On November 26, 1961, a surprising news appeared in the New York Times under the headline, "Ancient Antiquity Forgery Exposed in Iraq," and it was reported there. When the archaeologists began digging in Iraq in the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud earlier this year, they were surprised to find carved works not Assyrian but Egyptian, focused there recently in the fortress of Shalmaneser, the headquarters of the Assyrian army from the 9th century until the late 8th century. Although the robes of the tribute bearers are typically Assyrian, the ivories are carved in a style that predates the period in which they were made by centuries. If found elsewhere, they would be identified as Egyptian. It is believed that they are fabricated antiquities. Their purpose was to satisfy the taste of the rich for antiquities. The explanation given this week by David Oates, who heads the Nimrud excavation mission on behalf of the British School of Archaeology, is that the archaeologists exposed an ancient Assyrian antiques shop. The Egyptian carvings were made by local artists to meet the demands of wealthy clients for foreign antiquities. One room about 30 meters long is full of them, and 3 seasons of excavation were not enough to empty it. 2 additional rooms containing ivories have not yet been opened. The Late Bronze Age as a metaphor. An entire archaeological period is called the Late Bronze Age, 1400 to 1550 BCE. This is at the end of this period the exodus from Egypt took place according to tradition. What characterizes this period archaeologically? The difference between it and the preceding period, the Middle Bronze Age, is defined by a certain difference in the types of tools. Most tools from both periods are identical. There is only one difference. Two-tone pottery from Cyprus belongs only to the Late Bronze Age. But this difference that was established at the beginning of the research did not hold up over time, but on the contrary. The researcher of the period, Profern Bonomovitz, writes, "The two-tone tools are held as the most clear characteristic of the BHM-1, and their presence or absence serves as a measure of the existence of a settlement in this period." Paradoxically, the chronological picture becomes more blurred as research progresses. Import tools already appear in the complexes of the Middle Bronze Age. Is it correct to determine all the information regarding a certain period based solely on the assumption that certain import tools appeared only in it and not before? And could it not be that there were periods when imports flourished as opposed to periods when they were halted, or certain cities that used imports and others that did not? Or periods when there was an orderly departure without remains as opposed to abandonment periods that left many traces? And is there no other possibility to explain the absence of certain import tools, other than attributing all the layers in which they were found to a certain period? Are we clear at 100% that certain tools are not imported, and from exactly where they are not imported? Dating methods can explain any absurdity or ignore it. It does not affect the research. The Late Bronze Age 1 is not represented in Gezer, except in the cemetery there are pottery tools from Cyprus, bet and ivory from Egypt, and more. What is the logic in this? Archaeologists respond, the burial ceremony was a display of economic power. Is it logical? Perhaps in retrospect everything can be explained in different ways. Thutmose III conquered the land of Israel in the Late Bronze Age 1, and in his writing he recorded 75 cities in the land that had kings. Archaeology in this period reveals only 22 settlements, while the mountain regions were almost empty of settlement. It is possible that some of the places on the list are more landmarks or ruined sites. Gonin. It is interesting that Thutmose boasts of conquering ruins that by chance also had a king of their own. How do they differentiate between the Late Bronze Age 2, 1400 to 1200 BCE, and the Iron Age 1, 1200 to 1000 BCE? In the Iron Age, neck spout jugs were renewed in the mountain region and Philistine pottery on the coast. The problem is that reality is much more complex than such schemes. Researchers note that these characteristics are mixed with each other in every place and site, so in Tel Dan it was written by Biran, it seems that this is a pit that was dug into the layers of the BHM, and in the summary of the dig, Iron Age 1 layer in Dan is mainly represented by pits that served as dwellings dug into the Canaanite layers, Biran. The digger at Tel Afek describes the Iron Age 1 at the site. The area was not used by them for building as in our entire excavation area. No buildings were found but pits that were dug into the debris of the governor's palace, Kokavi. According to dry archaeology, people lived in Afek throughout this period, but they built nothing, just dug pits to bury their findings within other period findings. The same phenomenon was repeated in Hazor, in Tel Hefir, in Tel Polg, in Beit Marsim, in Deir el-Bala, until it was called settlement pits, Rosen. How do researchers explain this? It seems that there was an agreement then to minimize as much as possible the investment of energy and material in permanent buildings. Rosen Ebid, an ancient version of the Greens. It's interesting why pits were dug and archaeology was affected. Finkelstein says, it is possible that only ash areas were investigated in some places and therefore no residential buildings were found. We see that the area does not always conform to theories that distinguish between periods based on different tools, and reality is much more complex and complicated. Even the Egyptian inscriptions create the same confusion and complexity. In Tel El Amarna, where the famous Amarna letters were discovered, many import tools were found that are commonly attributed to the Late Bronze Age too, but the cities involved in the letters do not match the dating method according to tools. Jerusalem described in the letters as a large city, no tools from the BHM2 period were found. Mazar. We do not conclude from here to deny the testimony of the people of the period, simply assuming that archaeology cannot reflect everything to us, and there are various variables, unclear to us from a distance of 3,000 years and more. And what about Shechem, described in the Amarna letters as a strong kingdom? The summary is quite gloomy. A survey of 21 years revealed gloomy results. The Amarna period is a black hole in the Shechem area, Zertal. Neck spout jugs, which were in use in the Iron Age 1, continue the types of jugs of the Middle Bronze Age. In the middle there is a gap of 350 years in which there is no continuity in the development of the jug type, contrary to the central idea of archaeology, that a change in the style of tools is a recognition sign for periods, and vice versa. How? Finkelstein responds, it is not possible to rule out the possibility that the new settlers imitated the pits of the previous period whose shards were scattered in the area. Finkelstein. The gates of excuses were not closed, but it is hard to see these diagnoses as based. In Afek, an Iron Age 1 burial cave was found with neck spout jugs, but the seals on the fingers of the buried were of a type characteristic of the Middle Bronze Age. How? Jewelry was preserved and passed from generation to generation, and the Canaanite nobles bore a 300-year-old mallet as a seal. Kokavi. At Tel Shiloh, neck spout jugs were found alongside a jug from the days of the Middle Bronze Age. How? The people of Shiloh used an ancient jug they found at the site. Finkelstein. The pottery jug lasted for hundreds of years. What is the value of all the diagnoses if everything can be rationalized with any excuse? The entire being of the Late Bronze Age, based on its diagnoses, was born artificially in order to get along with Egyptian archaeology, and Professor Portugali from Tel Aviv University writes, "The Late Bronze Age, more than being an archaeological creation, it is actually a distinct political creature." The Amarna period raises unanswered questions. The excavations in Gordian the Hittite reveal an archaeological gap between the years 550–690 BCE, but this gap is filled with Hittite pottery from the Amarna period. They were buried in mud brought from another place in order to raise the mound. Young. This is how a 1,000-year confusion in the layers is resolved. The problem is that different sites yielded confusing results about the period. Murray, who researched in Encomi and Cyprus, found a jug that matched a jug from Amarna, and also to the decoration on a later burial cabinet by 800 years. So is a gold bell that matches the 8th century BCE, but was found in the Amarna layer, as well as in glassware. The Amarna letters are written in the Akkadian language. Here the assumption was born that Akkadian was an international diplomatic language, but no one has a convincing explanation why the Egyptians and Canaanites would need to use a language that never ruled the region. What international institution determined this, and for what purpose? In the Israeli layer at Tel Arad, Persian documents were discovered, which of course are much later than the Israeli period. How? Garbage pits, Aharoni. Arad pottery is sometimes written in a later language. The seal of Jehucal son of Shelemiah, mentioned in the book of Jeremiah 37:2, was discovered in the city of David, but in the wrong layer, about 600 years too early, Eilat Mazar. It seems that it is not always possible to make order and indicate layers, periods, dates. There are things that really cannot be reconstructed. And even if we manage to reconstruct, it does not turn the ideas into facts. It should be noted that recently there has been much talk about statistics in archaeology. This is certainly important to introduce another tool, but it must be remembered that statistics never reflect reality, something we encounter towards every election. It is ultimately an expression of basic assumptions and different ways to interpret things and findings. On the contrary, statistics have a wonderful power to ignore anomalies and deviations, and thereby miss the complexity in what is really happening. Statistically, the Israeli citizen of our time is a Likud voter, lives in Gush Dan, has an average income, respects tradition but is secular, and no more. The main claims against the biblical description are claims from silence. We did not find enough findings in a certain city that can be proven to belong to the period under discussion, and from here that the period was not and was not created. There are indeed evidences of settlement, but we did not find enough. We will address the claims in detail. But is there really a possibility to learn from the archaeological silence? Recently, 2014, the tomb of Alexander of Macedon was discovered in Egypt. The tomb was described by various historians. It is a giant structure on sandy ground. Archaeology was silent for 2,300 years, until it was accidentally discovered. A few years ago, the tomb of Herod was discovered. While it was known that he was buried in Herodium, they failed for centuries to locate the tomb, until it was accidentally discovered. What has not yet been discovered does not necessarily not exist. For centuries, the oldest manuscript of the Bible was the Leningrad Codex, until the hidden scrolls were accidentally discovered, which precede it by about 1,300 years. If the Romans had discovered the cave of the scrolls and burned it, this finding would also have been silent. We will review some of the famous archaeological silences that did not turn into denial of history, but were understood as natural shortcomings of archaeology and what it can offer us. In the port city of Gabal, which was thoroughly excavated, a rich finding from the period preceding 1200 BCE was found, and yet from the years 1200, 600 BCE, it is wonderful that the excavations in Gabal almost did not bring up any remnants. Albright. It is clear and known that the city existed and operated also in these years. In the famous city of Mari, thousands of written tablets were deciphered, and behold, not one of them mentions the great empire of Egypt. Did they really know nothing about Egypt in Mari? Or is something flawed in all our interpretation? Currently we have no answer. Abraham Malamat. The period after the decline of the Mycenaean culture until the 8th century BCE, about which we know almost nothing, is called the Greek Dark Age. There is no evidence of architecture and public buildings in the period between the Mycenaean palaces and the temples that arose throughout the Greek world in the 7th, the 6th centuries. Forgery. The knowledge about what happened during these years is so scant that some believe that nothing really happened. Amit. Of course, it is impossible to think that nothing happened. People lived, built houses, dug graves, etc. All human activity documented to some extent in archaeology. In Mycenae, tools from both periods were found side by side. Layer No. 11 contained, in addition to pottery from the 12th century, also a significant number of pottery from the 7th, the 6th centuries. This layer did not contain pottery dated to the years between them. No empty layer of silt was found between the pottery tools from the 12th century and those from the 7th century. In Beit Shean, many layers from the Bronze Age were discovered. In the last of them, Layer 5, an Egyptian temple was found with the steles of the kings Seti and Rameses, 13 to 12 centuries BCE. A layer, No. 3, from the Roman period, 1st century BCE, was also found. And where did 1,000 years between the Bronze Age and the Roman period go? Represented only by one thin layer, No. 4. The diggers concluded that the 10 to 7 centuries BCE should be attributed to Layer 5 on the Egyptian statues therein. But here a problem arose. Would there be statues of Egyptian kings who died centuries ago in the Israeli city? A proposal was made to attribute the statues to the layer before it, which was determined for the 11th century, A. Mazar, but still a gap remained between them and the layer in which they were found. The meaning of placing them in a period when there was no Egyptian presence raises questions. It is possible that these monuments were sanctified and transferred from layer to layer in a cultic context. In Megiddo, where ancient statue fragments were discovered in a later temple. The fragments were certainly brought up by the builders of the temple at the time of digging the foundations. Regarding the days of the 12th dynasty, we must say that all the Egyptian findings important from the days of the Middle Kingdom were found in layers of later settlement, apart from Gebal. A claim was made that they should be seen as objects that were traded in a later period. The assumption that was made about antique trade in a later period is not convincing. Since these were exceptional objects that were considered of great value, they were preserved and passed from generation to generation and thus survived in later layers only. Nadav Naaman. The archaeologist Metalis writes about Megiddo, "Not always do the archaeological findings in the land conform with the Egyptian sources. An Egyptian source tells about the journey of the Egyptian king Thutmose III to the land of Canaan in the middle of the 15th century BCE. In the description of the campaign, a siege is told that lasted 7 months around Megiddo, while archaeological research teaches that Megiddo at this time had no wall. So also in Ashkelon, in the reliefs of Merneptah, king of Egypt, who ruled Egypt at the end of the 13th century BCE, Ashkelon is depicted as a fortified city, but archaeological research did not find a wall from this period. In both sites, fortifications from the Middle Bronze Age were found, but there is no evidence of fortifications from the Late Bronze Age. Megiddo in the 14th century BCE presents a similar problem. From the Amarna letters, it appears that Megiddo was an important city in this period, but the archaeological finding indicates a small and sparse settlement. It seems, therefore, that caution is needed in the chronological determinations based on archaeological findings, or alternatively on the Egyptian sources. Sometimes they do not match but are intertwined very courageously. Also, small objects that are difficult to attribute importance to were found in later layers. Thus, in the southern city at Tel El Ajul, a bead, mallets, and a statuette all testify to this period, 12th dynasty, although it seems impossible to attribute any of the buildings uncovered in the area to such an early time, Tefnel. With such flexibility, there is no finding that cannot be explained. In a document of the Antiquities Authority, it is written, "The detailed archaeological researches in the Negev Mountains in recent decades clearly indicate that the reflection of historical events in the archaeological finding is more complex than initially thought. These events, whose imprint is noticeable at times in the sites of the inhabited land north of the Negev, are not reflected at all and fundamentally in the archaeological finding in sites south of the Be'er Sheva Valley. Alongside the fact that no evidence of a violent destruction that struck the Negev as a result of these events was found in the many excavations." Excuses. One of the claims made in relation to Joshua's conquest story is the fact that no wall from the Late Bronze Age was found in Jericho. This contradicts what is told in the book of Joshua. But does "we did not find" always constitute evidence? Professor Herzog says about the attempts to answer this. The claims that the walls were swept away, or that they continued to use the walls from the Middle Bronze Age, are invalid excuses that we would not have thought to offer in relation to any other period in any other city in which no walls were exposed. Herzog. Is that really the case? In Beth Zur no wall from the Iron Age was found. How is this explained? During this period they continued to use the fortified gate from the Canaanite Middle and Late periods. It is difficult to track the fortifications outside the city because the silt carried away the upper layers. DeVoe. In Hazer Middle Bronze. A giant wall was discovered that should be attributed to these layers. The wall and the moat in front of it were reused in Solomon's fortifications. Yadin, Hazor, Beth Zur. Based on material from the Iron Age A, the diggers determined that the residents at that time continued to use the wall from the Middle Bronze Age period. Finkelstein. Apart from the rooms that were attached to the wall, it is impossible to attribute any building to the Middle Canaanite period. Funk. Did the Canaanites encircle an empty city so that it would serve the Israelites when the time came? Or maybe there was a city from which we did not find anything. Apparently we did not find in any case is not always evidence. Dothan, Iron Age 1. In the opinion of the digger, the city residents continued to use the wall from the Middle Canaanite period. Usishkin, Shiloh, Iron Age. The buildings were erected outside the Middle Bronze Wall that was well preserved here and served them as a rear wall. Finkelstein. Also here returns the problem of Beth Zur. It is interesting to note that apart from the rooms described above, adjacent to the wall, no buildings from the Middle Bronze Age were found in Shiloh. Finkelstein. In contrast, from the Iron Age, when no wall was found, remnants were found almost in every one of the areas that were excavated. In buildings from the Iron Age, tools from the Middle Bronze Age were found. The pottery from the Middle Bronze Age came, it is assumed, from the remains that remained under their floors. The people of Shiloh used an ancient jug they found at the site. Finkelstein. Also in the excuse, Middle Bronze buildings were swept away, they make frequent use. Thus, at Tel Mikna, Ekron, where the Middle Bronze Age too is represented at the site by pottery only. Pottery from these periods was found in all the excavation areas. Gittin Dotan. Thus, at Tel Kinneret, the residential area in the Middle Bronze Age 2B and the Late Bronze Age is represented by pottery. Fritz. Thus at Tel Dor. No buildings from the Late Bronze Age were exposed, but many mallets and pottery tools were discovered there. 220B. Thus at Tel Hazy. Middle Bronze. Not in any of the excavations were architectural remains that can be attributed to this period identified, although pottery was discovered. Late Bronze. Material from this period was discovered while removing the later layers, 220C, and so Professor Herzog himself writes about his excavations at Tel Michal. The settlers of the settlement in the Middle Bronze Age 2B built a plaza. Buildings were probably erected on the plaza, but they did not survive. The findings belonging to this time period were exposed in the fill material of later periods. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to keep up with our explorations. We love hearing from you, so leave your thoughts in the comments below.